Hi, this is Alin from Master Your Web. You're watching HTML tutorial for absolute beginners, and in this video we will cover input attributes. So what is an input attribute? Well, an input attribute is a regular attribute applied to inputs.
Explosion.
If you don't remember what an attribute in HTML is, please go to the video about input attributes in HTML that will appear on the screen, hopefully. So we have actually quite a few input attributes that we can use. So we have the value attribute, then we have the required attribute, disabled attribute, read-only, and also the placeholder attribute. So the first one is gonna be the value attribute. We won't cover that one because we've already talked about it. But basically, the value attribute allows you to have a preset value to a specific input. That is pretty handy since sometimes we want to have this mechanism in place so that it will be easier for the user to have some default data. Next, you will have the required input attribute. This makes it possible to put a required condition on some inputs. So let's say that you want to have a form with a first name and also a last name, and you want to make sure that whenever the user clicks on the submit button, you will always have the first name and the last name. So the required attribute helps you do exactly that. So for that, in our Visual Studio Code, inside the form tag, we'll actually create a label for first name. I forgot that it's not a self-closing tag, so we'll close it. And inside of it we'll write first name. Then we'll create an input, type text with an ID of first name and the name of first name. Okay. So the way we add a required the required attribute is by simply typing required. All right, that's it basically. Now let's hit a couple of break tags, and let's take the last name as well. So we will copy this guy and we'll put it over here. So it's gonna be labeled for last name, and we will write last name. Then we'll have an input type text with an ID of last name and the name of last name. All right. So we'll also have the required property. And then after we create a couple of break tags again, we will create an input type submit with the value of submit. Alright, let's try to save it and see what the changes look like. Alright, so then we have like our first name and our last name. So let's actually try to click on the submit button, and you will see that we will have a warning message that says please fill out. Oh, it disappeared. Okay, so please fill out this field. Alright, that is basically a nice tool built in HTML. Well, rather HTML5, but still it's built in HTML. However, if we add something over here, for example, if we write like a first name and also a last name, then everything works as expected. You can see that the GET request is happening, because over here in the URL we attach like a first name and also a last name. But for instance, if we don't do anything, basically we are being presented with this warning message. And if we actually write something here, but we don't write anything over here as the last name, whenever we click on the submit button, the warning message will be over here. Alright, so that is the required input attribute. Our next attribute is gonna be the disable attribute. So the disable attribute, as you might have guessed, disables an input. And maybe you're thinking, why would we need that? What use cases will it have? Well, let's say that you're building a newsletter. And in that newsletter, you will have a field for the email, and if the user doesn't enter anything in the email, or as long as the text input is empty, the submit button is gonna be disabled. This is because we only want to send newsletters to people who actually enter some email there. Of course this application won't be possible using only HTML, but rather it's gonna be a combination between HTML and also JavaScript. But it's nice to know that you have a pretty decent use case for it. So the way we add the disable attribute is by simply replacing the required with the disabled. And you can see that the Visual Studio Code nicely suggests the disable property. And we will do the same thing for this one as well. Alright, so let's actually try to save it and look what we've got in the browser. It's disabled, not disabled. Alright, so basically whenever we try to click on this one or basically write anything in it, we can see that basically we cannot enter anything over here. Alright, so that was the disable attribute. Next on the list is gonna be the read-only attribute. This makes it impossible for us to edit an input, but rather it makes it only readable, not editable. So in a way it's similar with the disable attribute, but they have a few differences. So for instance, the read-only attribute, it can copy the text that it has, it can highlight a specific text, and also whenever you press tab, you will be focused on that particular text. And I believe that you've already guessed that, whenever we try to create a read-only attribute, we already have the property of read-only. And over here it's gonna be the same. So let's actually try to save it and look at our changes. So you can see that the input looks a bit different, and if we try to write something in it, we basically cannot. But let's try to make like a really small experiment, and let's try to give a default value of Aline. And over here I will have my last name, and let's try to actually see what we have. So as I mentioned, we cannot change anything in those fields, but what we can do is we can actually copy those values, as opposed to what we had when we were dealing with disable attributes. Next on the list is gonna be the placeholder input attribute. So placeholder describes what is gonna be the expected value of a certain input. So for instance, we can think of an input type password, which is gonna be used for storing a password, obviously, duh. And as a placeholder, we can have a text saying something like the password must have between 6 to 12 characters or something similar. So let's actually try to build that. So we will create like an input type password, and we will give it a placeholder of password must have between 6 to 12 characters. Alright, let's actually try to save it, and boom, you have our password. It does look a bit weird. Okay, so I will try to add it over here and also create like a couple of break tags so that it looks a bit nicer. Okay, so we have our password over here, and this is not actually the value of that specified password, because once you start writing something over here, basically that placeholder text disappears. However, if we actually delete this, we can see that we have the text. And apparently, since this input is not that long, basically the whole text is not visible, but that's totally fine. Alright, so those are the most common input types. In our next videos, we will start building a login form, a contact form, a registration form, and also a subscription form. So in order to get notified when I will upload those videos, just make sure to subscribe to this channel. So that's all for this video, we'll see you again on the next one. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the content and if you consider that it's at least 1% relevant, then please leave a like, a share, and subscribe to the channel for more content. We'll see you on the next one.